All right, so we're going to start off with our first weapon, which is this thing, the épée. Or alternatively, I mean, I've got an épée here, even if it's got like a foil hilt on it to make it more like a, late 19th century épée rather than a modern one. But yeah, like the same techniques can apply to small sword, to someone who's doing foil. Basically, I mean, I guess foil, dueling sword or épée is the application of foil, and a small sword is a slightly shorter épée with a smaller guard. So the techniques are not hugely different, but the technique will be the same. So I'm just going to take my earpiece out, which means that if you need to talk to me, I can't hear you, and you're going to have to wait. And I'm going to move into what is going to be the incredibly surreal experience, at least for me, of this, where I have to demonstrate of the technique, because I don't really have an assistant, and I don't have, and this is all meant to be like at-home solo training anyway. So it'd be a bit rude to be like, hey, at-home people, here's what you need to do. Here's what you do when you've got a training partner that you may or may not have. Cool. So épée is traditionally used in a very point-forward guard. So I'm either like this with flat, which is the traditional, or is the guard for dueling sword that Jules Jacob uses. And this is an early épée guard with foil, and also a small sword. You tend to see basically a medium guard, so tip it more, blade at more of an angle, more retracted. I'm quite fond of switching between these when I use this weapon, just because I find that you have different tactics and different distances for each. But fortunately for that, fortunately for us who are planning on using a saber or cutlass, the method of dealing with this is basically the same. So I get my saber, I come in, or my cutlass, I come in the medium guard. I can adopt a lower hanging guard. This is something that Alanson Wynne says to do, but this is his only advice against saber. And I like Alfred Hutton's advice better, when X's like this. So I'll get you to follow along. Grab your your cutlass simulator, your slashy boy, I guess we're going to call it. And all I want you to do is just cut X's. So extend out like you're extending into cut number 1, flick down to come to the same hand position as cut number 3, come all the way up to your same hand position as cut number 2, down and turn over to the same hand position as cut number 3, rotate up to number 1 again, and just cutting X's. And what this does is it means I'm basically covered, because no one can really thrust fast enough to come through this as a window. Which means my sword is basically clearing in front of me. And all I do is move in menacingly at my opponent, who will usually move back. In fact, every time I've done this to someone, all they can think to do is move back. There are times when they will try and go for your legs. So you need to slip your leg out of the way and have a hack at their face. So to show that from the side, I'm just cutting X's, happily cutting X's. Person I'm fighting gets frustrated. Let's pull my leg out of the way, and whichever is the next descending swing is the one I do at their head. Or I find it can be a little safer even to go at their arm, to cut low at their arm, just because you're intersecting their arm, which means they'll definitely not get your leg. Drops down, then you immediately crack them on, like if they start threatening your leg to try and get you to do something, immediately crack them on the hand. What you want to do to run them down basically is you want to move in zigzag. So see how I'm moving in, basically I'm moving back and forth, like I'm actually moving at angles. The reason for that, this is a trick, this is something that I picked up from boxing, moving back, if you're moving at an angle, they have to reorientate. And while it's fairly easy with forward movement, just because of the way our hips are aligned, to go one side, other side again, and chase them down that way. When you're moving backwards, you kind of have to reorientate and step back, which means at the very least, you've got a very, very slow step backwards. If not, you're basically having to reorientate and step back, which means that for every 2 minutes movements your opponent's doing, you're doing 3. So they will eventually catch up with you. And this is a way to get close enough to, you know, your small swordist to then just launch an attack. My personal preference is I like to just basically get close to engagement distance and then just come down and use this movement to dislodge their sword. So how am I going to display it? So just come down with one cut, I intersect their blade, just push down, and then come around straight at their, and I usually go for the sword arm. So I'm moving their tip down to try and expose their tip down so that they go like that to try and expose the sword arm. So it's longer hit, have a crack. But honestly, if you're doing this, you can now attack. And the problem that, the other problem the small swordist has is because their weapon is smaller and lighter, they need to make very committed parries in order to stop you, which means that their riposte is going to be very, really slow because they've had to really put a lot of effort into parrying. And so you can throw with a degree of impunity, but once you're doing this, you are setting the tone for the fight. So you've got a huge advantage. And honestly, there are plenty of times where I've done this and I've just walked my opponent into a wall. I had one person whose solution was basically to bring their sword up at about this angle, so if you can see that from the side, and just, you know, clash in so weapons clashed and then grapple me, which I didn't mind because I don't mind wrestling. The one thing to not do when you're facing a small sword is let your hand drift low. If you get to this position where your sword arm is vulnerable, they will stab you very quickly and even people who do a lot of foil fencing, who are used to going for the torso, will poke you in the arm out of frustration from you cutting X's at them. So yeah, so just if you're facing, but the moral of the story is if you're facing an epee or a small sword or a dueling sword, just cut X's at their sword. They won't be able to attack you, which is kind of funny in its own right. All right, cool. So before we move on, I'm just gonna put my earpiece back in. If you want to ask me any questions, by all means, although I do have some trivia if you want to type your question or even think your question, which is, I think I mentioned earlier, Alfred Hutton in Cold Steel, where he talks about what I just described, that method. He refers to the weapon you're fencing against not as a dueling sword or an epee or a foil. He calls it the French sword. And he's quite, like he uses every term he can to explain what the weapon is that is not just saying, oh yeah, it's just a, you know, it's just a dueling sword. Or actually, no, he says, he uses every term he can use to describe it except for foil, because the foil was a fairly common weapon in Britain at that time, even though the British used the French school for their foil fencing, which is kind of funny because he never uses the term the French sword anywhere else in the manual. But the subtext to all of this is, you know, Hutton is writing a military manual, and the British and the French have this interesting rivalry in this period where they are technically allies and had been quite closely aligned since the Crimean War. But in the Crimean War, the British kind of screwed up a lot, and there was this feeling that it was mostly because of the French that the Crimean War had been won. And so there's always there's this little bit of interesting kind of inferiority complex. And in Cold Steel, Hutton is very, very cautious to say that he's advocating a French method. I think that he might have got some blowback at some point for basically saying, oh, but we can just use French fencing, it's perfectly good. So yeah, he's got this section where instead of just being like, oh, so if, you know, you're mucking around in your fencing club, here's how you can beat a foil using a saber. He gives us this nationalist lens where he's like, oh, you know, should you, a good British person with your good British saber? And Hutton makes very clear that he considers the saber a very British weapon, descended of the noble backsword. Should you be facing someone armed with a French sword, which is, you know, just an epee, this is what you can do to beat them, and the subtext that being the British, at least British fencing, if not the British, are superior to the French. So yeah, there's a bit of kind of cultural history for you. All right, so are there any questions before we move on? Either about the technique or alternatively about, like, you know, 19th century fencing cultural history. I'll take that as a no, so I'm just going to pause recording and we'll be back in a minute.